Hello, students. Today we begin our study of organic macromolecules, the molecules of life. These are sometimes known as biomolecules, and they really are the large, complex chemical molecules that make up all the cells of our bodies, all the cells of living organisms. Specifically, we're going to be discussing today concept 3.2 all the way through 3.3, pages 48 through the top of 53. So make sure you have read pages 48 to 53 in your Biology in Focus textbook before you begin viewing this lesson. So let's go ahead and get started. Every cell in your body, every cell within every living organism is composed of organic macromolecules. Chemically speaking, you are a collection of trillions and trillions of proteins, carbohydrates, and other organic macromolecules. Now let's break down this term just a bit. When we say organic, the meaning of that term is a bit different than maybe what you're used to. If you go to Food Lion or Harris Teeter to the grocery store and you purchase organic produce, foods that are labeled organic, that means that maybe the foods are not genetically modified, the crops were grown without chemical pesticides or chemical fertilizers. It sort of means all natural. Well, that's not exactly what we mean when we use the term organic in this context. Organic comes from the same root word as organism. So it means that it's a carbon-containing compound that's somehow associated with and or produced by living organisms. So it's kind of a two-part definition. In biology, when we say organic, we mean that the chemical compound contains carbon, it must contain carbon, and that it's somehow associated with a living organism, plant, animal, bacteria, something like that. And then secondly, the term macromolecule means exactly what you would expect. Macro is the opposite of micro. Of course, micro means very small, tiny. Macro means large. So macromolecules are large, complex molecules. Okay, so there are two terms that will keep coming up as we study these organic macromolecules. It's almost like a theme that's going to keep repeating throughout these lessons. And those two terms are polymer and monomer. A polymer is a macromolecule composed of many small repeating subunit molecules that have been joined together. So many macromolecules are polymers. They're large, complex molecules, long chain-like molecules that are made up of individual building blocks. I'll show you a good kind of representation of that in just a minute. The small building blocks that make up polymers are called monomers. So a monomer is a small, simple building block molecule that can be many monomers can be joined together in kind of a repeating pattern to form a much larger polymer. So if that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, just think about a pearl necklace. We can all kind of visualize what a pearl necklace looks like. So if I'm just looking at one individual pearl, that would be a monomer. That's one individual building block. But if I join that pearl with another pearl, and then I join another one, and another one, and another one, and another one, I can build something that's much larger, much more complex. The entire necklace then would be the polymer. individual pearl is the monomer. The entire necklace would be the polymer. So that's a pretty good sort of metaphor for how this works. As we study organic macromolecules, we're going to explore 4 different major categories, and you can see them listed here. First, we will learn about carbohydrates, which are mainly sugars and starches and other things that are composed of sugars. Then I think next we'll do lipids. We'll cover the various types of lipids. These include things like fats and oils, things that do not dissolve well in water. Then we'll circle back to proteins and finally nucleic acids, which get their name from the fact that many of them are found in the nucleus. Nucleic acid comes from the word nucleus. That's where many of them are found. So these are the 4 main categories, the 4 main types of organic macromolecules that make up your cells, that make up the cells of all living organisms. And 3 of the 4, carbs, proteins, and lipids, make up your food. Everything that you eat is composed of either carbohydrates or proteins or lipids or some mixture of those 3. So this is really important in biology, and we're going to begin this lesson from here on out is going to focus mainly on carbohydrates, and then I will record separate lessons covering the other 3. So let's get started here with carbohydrates. So all life on Earth is sometimes described as being carbon-based life forms. And that is because the macromolecules that make up living cells, not just carbohydrates, but all of the macromolecules that we're going to be learning about, contain large amounts of carbon. One of the main structural components of these macromolecules is carbon atoms. Now, organic macromolecules also contain, of course, other elements too: hydrogen, oxygen, sometimes nitrogen, sometimes phosphorus, occasionally sulfur. But carbon is kind of the main component. And to understand why is to understand the extreme versatility of the carbon atom. A single carbon atom is able to form 4 separate covalent bonds with 4 different atoms at the same time. And there's not very many there's not very many atoms that can do that. There's not very many elements that have that amount of versatility. In fact, carbon is the smallest and simplest type of matter that can form 4 bonds simultaneously. And to understand why is simple. If we look at the atomic structure of carbon, it has an atomic number of 6. So I don't know if we can quite see, but there's 6 protons in the nucleus. Those would be the blue circles. And then there's also 6 neutrons. You can't quite see all of them in this picture. And 6 electrons. And of course, the electrons are out here in the electron shells. Remember, the first shell can hold 2, and that leaves 1, 2, 3, 4 valence electrons. Now remember, for carbon to become stable, it needs 8 in this outer shell. And it only has 4. It only has 4 valence electrons. So what that means is carbon is going to need to bond. It's going to share electrons with other atoms in order to achieve stability, but it's going to have to share with 4 different atoms, or at least it's going to have to form 4 different bonds. And basically what that means is that carbon is extremely versatile and can be used to build very complex 3-dimensional shapes. So it's kind of hard to tell where the carbon atoms are in this picture, but this is an enormous protein molecule called hemoglobin. which is really important in red blood cells in our bodies. It carries oxygen inside your blood cells. Um, a large component of this protein is carbon atoms. Many thousands and thousands of carbon atoms all bonded together with other atoms to form this very complex three-dimensional shape. And you'll find that that shape, three-dimensionality, and the three-dimensional shape of organic compounds is really important, because very often the molecule will not function properly if it doesn't have the correct shape. And that's especially true for proteins, but we'll get to that later. We're going to focus on carbohydrates today. So remember, there's four major categories of organic macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We're going to focus on carbohydrates for the remainder of our lesson today. You can think of carbohydrates mainly as sugars and starches. They are good sources of food energy. So when you eat foods that are high in carbohydrate, there's a lot of energy stored in that, especially starch, and so it provides energy for our bodies. Carbohydrates get their name from the two of the three components that make them up. Carbohydrates are made of carbon atoms, obviously, hydrogen atoms, and also oxygen atoms. And most carbohydrates follow this pattern. This is the general formula for carbohydrate, where you have 2 hydrogen atoms for every 1 carbon atom, and also 2 hydrogen atoms for every oxygen. So it's a ratio that most carbohydrates will follow, and that'll make more sense when we start looking at some of the specific carbohydrates. Foods that are rich in carbohydrates, many of these are foods that we love to eat: bread, potatoes, rice, pasta, fruits, many fruits and veggies, certainly sweets. All the sweet desserts that we love to eat contain sugar. Sugar is a carbohydrate. So in terms of food, one thing to keep in mind is that while carbohydrate does not always mean sugar, you can eat a starchy potato and it doesn't really have any sugar in it, but it does have a lot of starch. And when you eat that potato and you digest it, you chemically break down that starch inside your digestive system. Guess what it turns into? It turns into sugar. So all carbohydrates sort of become sugar when we digest them. And that's important to remember. It's a wonderful source of food energy, but we don't want to overdo it. You don't want to take in too much carbohydrate, because it does break down and turn into sugar, and too much sugar can cause us to put on some extra pounds, and is not necessarily really good for us. Okay, there are different subcategories of carbohydrates, and these subcategories are based on the size of the carbohydrate. So the most basic, the smallest, simplest carbohydrates are called monosaccharides, single sugars. Mono means one, saccharide means sugar, so this literally means single sugar. The most famous example of a monosaccharide is glucose, and we're going to talk a lot about glucose in this class. You need to know the formula for glucose. Notice that pattern where you have twice as many hydrogen atoms as carbon atoms, twice as many hydrogen atoms as oxygen. So it fits that 1-to-1 ratio that I mentioned that's pretty common for carbohydrates. So this is the formula for glucose. I said glucose is kind of a famous example. Here's why glucose is so important in biology. First of all, glucose is the sugar that is dissolved in your blood. It circulates throughout your body in your bloodstream. And without it, you die. It's that simple. Because glucose is the primary fuel that your cells burn inside their mitochondria to provide energy. Without glucose, cells starve for energy, and without energy, cells die. So glucose is our blood sugar and our primary fuel for making energy in our cells, or releasing energy, I should say. You can't technically make energy. The other reason glucose is important in biology is because glucose is sort of the final product of photosynthesis. When we say plants make their own food using energy from the sun, that's very true. But that food that plants make is actually this sugar, glucose. Whenever I teach this lesson live in the classroom in front of students, I always pause at this point and have my students draw the ring structure of the glucose molecule. So this would be a good time to pause the video and just right there in your notes, just draw this molecule. It's important that you recognize glucose when you see it. Now the basic shape is a hexagon. So if you start with this oxygen atom and then you bond it to a carbon, bond that to another carbon, there's a carbon, there's a carbon, there's a carbon. That's a hexagon, a six-sided ring. And then there's one more carbon that's sticking up on top of the molecule. This is the sixth carbon. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's the sixth carbon right there. Each one of the carbon atoms has some hydrogens that it's bonded to, covalent bonds, and also what's called a hydroxyl group. This is an oxygen and a hydrogen. You can see each carbon has at least one, each carbon has one hydroxyl group bonded to it. So that's a glucose molecule. That is the smallest, simplest, most basic type of carbohydrate. It's a monosaccharide because this whole thing is one single sugar. Okay, glucose is not the only monosaccharide. There are some other simple sugars that fall into the carbohydrate family. So fructose is a monosaccharide that's commonly found in fruits. Fructose actually has the same chemical formula as glucose, but it's arranged differently. So instead of a hexagon shape, it actually has I believe it has a pentagon shape. So there's some of these atoms are shifted around in a different configuration. So very similar. These two sugars are very similar. Fructose is slightly sweeter than glucose. Fructose is the reason apples and bananas taste so yummy. And then galactose, which is a component of milk sugar, is also a monosaccharide. Now, an interesting thing happens inside living cells. Sometimes it is necessary to transport sugars around inside the organism. So in an animal, that might involve the circulatory system, but in a plant, it would involve moving sugars around inside the stem of the plant, inside a tissue called phloem tissue. But in order to transport sugars, and certainly to store excess sugar, it's sometimes necessary to combine the sugars together. So the way that is done is a chemical reaction called dehydration synthesis. Sometimes it's referred to as a condensation reaction. And the way that works is the two sugars are side by side, and an enzyme comes in and removes one oxygen and one hydrogen from the first sugar. And then that same enzyme also removes a hydrogen atom from the second sugar. Now, if you think about it, with those three atoms, what can you form? A water molecule. So this is literally removing water from the sugars hence the name dehydration. But by removing those atoms, it frees up some space so that this sugar, there's actually a carbon atom that would sit right here. This carbon atom can bond to this oxygen atom, and here's what the finished product looks like. Synthesis means to join two things together. And so what we end up with is no longer a single sugar. It's two sugars that are covalently bonded together to make a larger sugar. This is no longer a monosaccharide. Maltose would be considered a disaccharide. Dehydration, removal of water. Synthesis means joining two things together. It's a chemical reaction that allows two monomers to be joined together to build something larger and more complex. Another example would be to join a glucose sugar to a fructose sugar. There's that pentagon, five-sided shape that I mentioned. Fructose is very similar to glucose, but notice the shape is a little different. Well, if you join a glucose and a fructose, you make the disaccharide sucrose, which we all know about. That's the sugar that we use in the kitchen. That's what we call table sugar. If you go to Food Lion and buy a 5-pound bag of Dixie Crystals, that's regular sucrose, table sugar. Now, sometimes it's necessary to take a disaccharide and to split it apart. In other words, sometimes we need to break this bond and separate the two sugars so that they are once again individual monosaccharides. The joining together was called dehydration synthesis. The exact opposite of that is called hydrolysis. That means adding water, hydro, to split something. Lysis means to split. So hydrolysis means that a water molecule is added back on to this spot right here to literally break these two sugars apart. So part of that water gets stuck onto this sugar, the other part of that water gets stuck on, excuse me, to the other sugar, and it splits that sucrose in half. Notice that the enzyme that regulates this chemical reaction is called sucrase. So sucrase is the enzyme that breaks apart sucrose. A lot of times you can tell what an enzyme does by its name. So make sure you understand the difference between dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis. They are exact opposites. Dehydration synthesis, which is also called condensation, two different names that mean the same thing, is the removal of water to join monomers together. This is how we build polymers. This is how we build large molecules. Hydrolysis is the opposite. Hydrolysis adds water to break a bond, to break apart a large molecule, to split it into smaller molecules. Dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis. Okay, so you've seen what a disaccharide looks like. Now let's talk about some examples of disaccharides. Maltose is a combination of glucose joined with another glucose. Maltose is sometimes called wheat sugar. It's the sugar that's found naturally in wheat and corn. Incidentally, little side note here, maltose is the sugar that yeast feed on in the beer making process. So the fermentation that produces beer is actually a biological process where maltose sugar from wheat and barley is fed to living yeast, fungus cells, and they metabolize the sugar and produce ethyl alcohol, which is what turns it into beer. So, little side note there. Lactose is the naturally occurring sugar in milk. Notice lactose is a glucose bonded to a galactose. So those would be the two monosaccharides that are joined together to make this disaccharide. Incidentally, some humans are missing or have a defective enzyme called lactase, which means they are unable to digest this sugar. So these individuals who are missing a functional lactase enzyme, if they consume a large amount of milk or dairy products, this sugar builds up in the intestines and is undigestible, and so it creates irritation. We call these folks lactose intolerant, and you may know somebody, you might be one of those individuals. Sucrose, I mentioned before, regular table sugar, is also a disaccharide. Now, the largest and most complex of all the carbohydrates are the polysaccharides. And I wish I could make this picture zoom in, but I want you to look at this long green strand. It's really not green in real life. I don't know why they illustrated it that way. But if you look at this long strand, this is amylose, which is just a fancy name for starch. This is a starch molecule. And if you look at just one of these little shapes, right where my little laser pointer is, you see right there? If you look very carefully, that shape is a hexagon. So what do you suppose that is? That's one glucose. That's right. So this is a glucose bonded to a glucose, bonded to a glucose, bonded to a glucose, 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 glucose. You get it. Like hundreds of glucoses in a long, long, long continuous chain. That's what a polymer is. Starch is a polymer of glucose. It's a long, long chain of glucose bonded to glucose, bonded to glucose, bonded to glucose. And that's really what all polysaccharides are. Now, there's some subtle differences in the different types of polysaccharides, but basically they are all very long chains of sugar. So starch is the form of polysaccharide that plants make when they need to store energy. Glycogen, which you can see looks very similar, is just a little bit more branched and a little bit more connected than the starch molecules. This is what animals make. This is what we make in our liver whenever we have some excess sugar that we need to store for later use. So I'm going to go through 4 important examples of polysaccharides. Make sure you know these 4 examples and make sure you know the function of each. Okay, I mentioned starch already. Starch is a polysaccharide. It's made by plants. It's used for short-term energy storage in plants. Starch is made from the excess glucose that's produced in photosynthesis. So on a bright, sunny summer day, with all that sun energy, plants are able to make more glucose than they need. And so the plant needs a way to store that excess glucose, save it for literally a rainy day. And that's what starch is. It's just a long chain of excess glucose that can be stored away inside the plant and used at a later time. When we eat the starchy foods from a plant, when we eat potatoes or we eat rice, we're eating the starch that the plant made for energy storage, and see, we can then use that as our own energy source. That's why starch is such a high energy food. Now, animals like humans cannot make starch. Our bodies cannot manufacture starch, but we make something that's very similar. If you look at the picture, look how similar starch and glycogen are. They're both just long, long chains of glucose, but they're joined together in slightly different ways. So glycogen is basically the animal version of starch. This is what animals make when we have an excess amount of glucose that we need to store. Animals make glycogen primarily in the liver. I talked about this in one of our earlier lessons. This is a great example of homeostasis. So if you have just eaten a meal, especially a high carbohydrate meal, you're going to have an excess amount of glucose in your bloodstream. And so your pancreas is going to secrete a hormone called insulin. And insulin causes two responses to happen in the body. Two different things happen as a result of insulin to help you lower your blood glucose level. First of all, insulin stimulates all the cells of the body to take in some of that excess glucose. So that's going to reduce the amount of glucose in the blood. But secondly, and maybe most importantly, insulin stimulates your liver specifically to take in large amounts of glucose and then join those glucose molecules together. Glucose bonded to glucose, bonded to glucose, bonded to glucose. What chemical reaction is taking place right there? What was the name of that chemical reaction where two glucoses can be joined together by removing a water molecule? Do you remember? Dehydration synthesis. That's right. So the liver begins doing lots and lots and lots of dehydration synthesis in order to convert glucose into glycogen. And that lowers the amount of glucose in the blood. Here are some foods that are rich in starch. Remember, starch is a polysaccharide. Now, there's two other polysaccharides that I want to talk about. These are not used for energy storage. They're used for structural purposes. So cellulose is a polysaccharide, again, made by plants. We talked about starch, which is made by plants. Cellulose also is made by plants. And plants make cellulose to form the outer wall that surrounds each individual plant cell. This is what gives plant tissue firm, rigid structure. This is what allows plants to grow up nice and tall. So I think I've got a picture. Yeah, here we go. So if you're looking at plant cells under a microscope, this would be the nucleus, this would be the cytoplasm. And notice around the perimeter of the cell is this rigid wall, kind of this tan color that you see. That is cellulose. Now there's also a plasma membrane. Every cell is surrounded by a lipid membrane, but plant cells have this additional outer covering called the cell wall, and it's made of cellulose. It's very fibrous, it's very tough, but if you look at it close up, what is this? What is this hexagon shape? You got it. That's a glucose bonded to a glucose, bonded to a glucose, glucose, glucose. So chemically speaking, cellulose and starch and glycogen and all polysaccharides are very similar. They're long, long chains of glucose. Finally, another polysaccharide is called chitin. And chitin is found in two distinct locations in nature. Chitin is found in the cell walls of fungi, like mushrooms, for example. The fibrous texture of a mushroom is because the cell walls are made of this strong polysaccharide. And another place where chitin is found is the exoskeleton of arthropods, insects, spiders, things like that, shrimp, crabs, lobster, any animal that has kind of a crunchy outer casing on its body. That's an exoskeleton. If you've ever stepped on a bug and heard that crunch that we all hate to hear, that's the exoskeleton. It's made out of sugar, technically, or at least long chains of sugar, because that's what polysaccharides are. Now, one final point that I want to make here, and this is a kind of a subtle point, but it's important to understand. When we talk about polysaccharides like cellulose and starch, they're essentially the same thing, right? They're long chains of glucose bonded to glucose, bonded to glucose, bonded to glucose. Well, if cellulose and starch are so similar, then why is it that we as mammals can easily digest starch? It digests almost instantly as soon as we swallow it and breaks down into sugar. And yet cellulose, which is sometimes called dietary fiber, passes through our digestive tract virtually unchanged. We're unable to digest it. Mammals can't break it down. And the reason is there's a very subtle difference in how the sugars are joined together. So this is a little hard to see, but if you look in between these two glucoses, do you see how that oxygen right there, you see my laser pointer? You see how the oxygen is sort of angled up, and then the next oxygen is angled down, and then the next one is up, and the next one is down? When those oxygen angles alternate from high to low to high to low, that's called a beta glycosidic linkage. And you don't really need to understand what that means, but notice it's different in starch. In starch, all these oxygens are pointing in the same direction. They're all pointing down. That's called an alpha glycosidic linkage. And the long story, to make a long story short, the digestive enzymes of mammals are able to recognize and break down alpha linkages, but our digestive enzymes are unable to recognize beta linkages. Now, this presents a major problem if you happen to be a cow. Because think about it, what do cows what do cows primarily eat? What do they spend most of their day eating out in the pasture? Look at the picture. Grass, right? Or hay, which is a type of grass. And that grass, that hay, is almost 100% cellulose. It's a polysaccharide that a mammal, like a cow, cannot even digest. And so how do they do this? Well, we all know that cows have multi-chambered stomachs, and so they can chew the grass and swallow it, and then they can regurgitate it and chew it again. This is called chewing the cud. Then they swallow it again, and it stays in their stomach a long, long time because it's a multi-chambered stomach, and that helps break it down. But the truth is, there are bacteria that live in the stomach and the intestines of cows, and the microorganisms, the bacteria, can break down the cellulose. If it wasn't for these microorganisms, cows would die. Cows would not be able to digest their food. So this is a great example of what biologists call a symbiotic or mutualistic relationship, where the bacteria benefit from living inside the cow certainly benefits from the bacteria. Here's some pictures of insect exoskeletons and a mushroom. Those are two places where we find the polysaccharide chitin. And that looks like a good place for us to stop this lesson. This concludes our lesson on carbohydrates. We will explore lipids and proteins and nucleic acids in future lessons. I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye-bye. Bye.